Welcome to Holy Health, the podcast where cutting-edge health insights meet timeless biblical wisdom. Join us as we explore the latest in wellness, fitness, and mental health, all while grounding our journey in the spiritual truths and guidance found in the Torah. Whether you're looking to nourish your body, mind, or soul, we'll help you live a life of balance, vitality, and faith. Tune in to discover how to achieve holistic health through the perfect blend of modern science and ancient wisdom. Let's dive into the fullness of life, body, and spirit together. Hey guys, welcome back to Holy Health. I know it's been a couple of weeks since we put out a new episode, and with the coming of the new year, as we move into Elul and approach Rosh Hashanah, I'm hoping to get back to recording more regularly. Not necessarily recording more regularly because I've actually continued to record, but we just have not been so consistent in putting out episodes. And I hope to bring that consistency back. We are nearly 2 years after this war, and I think things need to go back. We need to become more consistent with things. And this is something that I'm going to try to do in the coming year. I have a lot of episodes and more interviews lined up with some topics that I think are really going to interest you guys. And I'm a big believer that if something is easy to do, if it doesn't cost a lot of money, if it can't hurt, it could only help, why wouldn't you do that thing? And this week's episode is actually, I guess we could call it a rerun. It came out pretty soon after the start of the war. And I think that this is not just an episode that people could hear again, but if you hadn't heard it, this is a great time to hear it because salt is not the villain that people have been led to believe. And adding the right kind of salt into your diet is not only easy to do, it not only has tremendous health benefits, but it's inexpensive and it's simple and it actually tastes good. So why wouldn't you do it? And we have a bunch of other topics like this coming up as well. And at a certain point, I'll probably sum some of these topics up for you as well. Let's do the things that are the low-hanging fruit, that are easy to do, that don't take a lot of effort, that don't cost a lot of money. And let's start doing them. And salt is one of those topics. I enjoyed re-listening to this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it the first time. Darryl is a fascinating person with some great insight into the health benefits of salt. This is something he's worked in most of his life, and it is not the villain that you've been led to believe. If you have high blood pressure and you've been told not to eat a lot of salt, you need to hear this. But everybody needs to hear this because everybody has a loved one, or everybody knows someone who's been diagnosed with high blood pressure and has probably been told to stay away from salt. I did decide that it would be great to add a new Torah extra because every Torah person we hear from has their own insights. And I knew Idan would do such a good job as she always does. Not only did she bring us some beautiful spiritual wisdom from the Torah on salt, but she actually was able to tie it into Elul and Rosh Hashanah. And what better time? It was just Rosh Chodesh yesterday. This will only come out on Thursday, but I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. And I hope that you're going to be tuning in for some upcoming episodes. Next week, I have a special interview with Tommy Waller, a Christian Zionist who's been living here in Israel for over 20 years. What is a healthy relationship between Christians and Jews? It is such an important topic, especially during this month, as you're going to hear. So I hope that you guys will be back to listening. Please share this episode and any of them that you feel could help those around you. Please follow us across all the different social media platforms. I love hearing feedback from you guys. And I am looking for some new Torah people to come on and help me. If you think that you'd be good at that, please reach out to me as well. And during the episode, you'll hear I actually asked Darryl, where does the expression "take it with a grain of salt" come from? Right? And he didn't know either. So I thought I should at least leave you guys with that. It's actually an old Roman expression. It came from when people needed to take something or would take something that was thought to possibly be poisonous. They would be told to take it with a grain of salt because salt was thought to possibly lessen the effects of the poison. And in this episode, you're going to hear why. And it's sort of went from that to start meaning, take things with caution, right? Because if you took this grain of salt with the poison, you would kind of cautiously be optimistic and hoping that it would lessen the effect of the poison. It's sort of, we know what the expression means. It means to take things with a grain of salt, take them with a little bit of caution. It may not be 100% what you think you're hearing. So I'll leave you guys with that. And as always, have a Shabbat Shalom. And we are hoping and praying this will be the last. By the end of Shabbat, our hostages should be home and we should have a swift end to the war where our soldiers all come home safely. Shabbat Shalom. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Holy Health. My guest today is Darryl Bouchard. Darryl is passionate about healthy living, healthy eating, and lifelong learning. Darryl grew up working for the family mineral business in Redmond, Utah, and earned a Bachelor of Science degree at Southern Utah University, followed by an MBA at Western Governors University. So welcome.
Dara, thanks for having me on your program today. Super excited. I know people think salt is just salt and salt's a boring topic, but hopefully by the end of our discussion today, people will realize that salt is actually a very fascinating topic.
100%. I totally agree with you. And one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this is because people have this perception that salt is bad for you, that salt causes high blood pressure, and that we should stay away from too much salt. So what do you have to say about that?
You know, there was a study years ago in the 1950s that kind of pointed to salt as being this health destroyer, similar to earlier studies that linked fat, that all fat was bad for us. And yet today we've found that's just not the case. And we have to have good fats and the right fats. It's essential for our eyes, for our brains. So salt is also essential. What's interesting is even if somebody hears that salt's bad for them or that they need to eat less salt, when they go to the hospital, the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to get an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. And our tears are salt, our urine is salt, our sweat is salt. If salt was bad, we wouldn't get it intravenously. In fact, an IV of anything but saline solution, which is 0.9% salts, would actually be deadly to the body. An IV of distilled water or tap water or tea or coffee would be worse. I mean, we have to have salt to live. And so hopefully we can dive into more of those details today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, today you go into the store and there are so many different types of salt. There's Himalayan and there's sea salt and there's, I don't know, iodized and Celtic salt and Celtic salt. And I've heard all of these different things. Like, what's the difference in salt?
Well, if we go back to nature, I like to believe that nature has it right with products, and we try to get back to, it's hard to improve on an apple. An apple's a beautiful, created fruit for us, and to try to make it better just seems silly. Even if you could take an apple and break all the parts and put it back together as an apple, it just doesn't seem in my mind quite right. And salt is the same way. If we went back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, the nature of salt to our ancestors was very different from the salt that we might find in the grocery store today. And if we go back to any civilization, every civilization started around access to the salt deposits because humans need salt to live, not only for food preservation, which it does that, but also because our bodies are saline solution in motion. And so our animals need salt, we need salt to preserve food. And so civilization started around these salt deposits, which is why every religious text talks about the importance of salt. And there's scriptures about, salt losing its savor, and there's scriptures about the importance of salt. And and salt was used as cleaning and cleansing rituals. If you want to clean your hands, you can use salt to clean your hands. If you want to clean a butcher block, you can use salt, and it actually cleans and sterilizes. Militaries have used salt to clean wounds and to heal. Your dentist will tell you to Gargle with salt water if you've had a tooth extracted, because of the way salt is so healing. And all of our ancestors knew this. Every religious text and religious leader of the past knew this. And yet today we hear salt's bad and we need to avoid it. So obviously there's a disconnect. Before we had the refrigerator, all of us would have eaten more salt because our food outside of season would have had to have been preserved with salt, be it meats, jerkies, kimchi, sauerkrauts, fermented veggies would all use salt to preserve the food. And so it's not the salt, it's the way salt has changed and the way our diets have changed. And so back to your question about the difference in salt, if you and I lived, thousands of years ago, we would have gone to a couple of places to get this life-giving salt. One of those would have been to go to the ocean. We could have gone to the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Japan. We could go to anywhere with salt, and salt in the ocean occurs about 3% salt, 2 to 3% salt. Our bodies are 1%, roughly. And so that's why when we go in the ocean, we open our eyes, it burns our eyes because it's 2 to 3 times more salty than we are. Now, salt and water have something called max salinity. So if you take a salt crystal or a jar of salt and put it in water, the water will dissolve the salt until it hits 26%. That's max salinity. So in reverse, to produce salt thousands of years ago, we would have gone to the Mediterranean. We could have taken the seawater, put it in a tub or a vat, evaporated it off, and we would have been left with salt, about 3% salt in the bottom of that vat, because once the salt hits 26%, as the air still evaporates, then the salt falls out of suspension onto the bottom of that pan. Now, you mentioned a brand called Celtic or the French Gray that many of your listeners might be familiar with. That's one of the great brands of current day salt because they actually use the same process that was used thousands of years ago. And they would take the salt water, in the case of Celtic, off the coast of Brittany, France. Now, if you just put salt water on a sandy beach, the salt water just dissolves or just disappears back into the sand. So to combat that, you take clay, which is the right kind of clay, creates a layer that the water can't seep down into the sand. And so they'll use this French clay to create a pond. The salt then starts as seawater and starts to evaporate. And when you're left, this salt settles off onto this gray clay that they then go and rake up the salt crystals, and it rakes up this gray clay with it that gives us that French gray color. It's the natural salt crystals from the Mediterranean or from the coast of Brittany, France, and then it has the gray clay that has been captured or settled off with the salt crystals. And so when our ancestors produced salt, they produced it in a holistic way. They went to the ocean. The ocean occurs with potassium, magnesium, calcium, iodine, which is why sea food and seaweed is rich in iodine. And then they would let that all settle off together in a holistic product. Then they scrape that up and they bring in those mineral-rich clays. And so you get this beautiful natural salt. The other way our ancestors would get salt would be to watch the animals. And there are some prehistoric or ancient seabeds that are deposited within the earth. Now, I'm not a geologists say this happened eons ago, and I wasn't alive back then to confirm or deny any dates, but it was long before you and I were on the planet. And so these salt beds, these ancient salt beds, are the same process that it took place eons before. And so the salt crystals that occur in the Himalayan region in Pakistan and Nepal that create the Himalayan salt are these ancient seabeds that were trapped within the earth. And so that's, again, a very natural version of salt. Now, about the turn of the century, around the early 1900s, the refrigerator was invented. People started to be able to preserve food longer. And scientists realized that seawater occurs with all of these other trace elements: magnesium, potassium, calcium, and they came up with a series of processes that they could take that seawater through and slowly leach off some of those other minerals. So if you fly over the San Francisco Bay today, you will see all of these evaporation ponds where they can take the seawater, move it into a pond, use a different liner, and pull off the potassium. Move it to the next pond and pull out the magnesium chloride. Move it to the next pond, pull out the calcium. So through a series of ponds, they can manipulate the way the natural salt was created. They can still sell it as salt. It would be similar to if you and I had an orange farm and we were growing citrus and we found our way to pull out the ascorbic acid from the orange before we sold the orange at the market. You and I are geniuses at that point because now we can make money off the ascorbic acid and we can still sell the orange. And salt manufacturers realized the same, that they could take off some of these other elements, sell those off, and then still sell it as salt. So that was the first problem. The second challenge, now that we have this demineralized salt, is that salt in nature is hygroscopic. If we look at this salt crystal here, if I were to put this on the counter in a very humid environment, it's going to suck water out of the air because it's hygroscopic. So this is why your salt will start to clump in your shaker because it actually is sucking water out of the air. Now, that's salt's job. Salt's job in the body is to help regulate intercellular and extracellular fluids through the sodium-potassium pump. And so salt has this ability to attract moisture. So scientists got together and said, look, what kind of chemicals could we coat the salt crystal with to stop its ability to interact with moisture? And they came up with a whole list of chemicals that would allow the salt to stop interacting with moisture. And it was added as an approved additive for salt. The challenge is now you take this salt that's supposed to interact and regulate moisture in the body, you coat it with a crystal or with a chemical to stop its ability to interact with moisture, and then you take salt that was a holistic natural product that has been around since the dawn of the earth, and now we've changed it by removing these other trace elements and minerals that are found in our bodies and found in seawater. Then we take this product and we put it on food that should never be called food. And we eat copious amounts of it, and we wonder why we have sickness and we wonder why salt has a bad rap. It's not the salt, it's the processed salt on the processed foods that we shouldn't be eating. And I know I kind of rambled for a long time there, but
it actually makes a lot of sense. So at the end of the day, it's not salt isn't bad for you. It's what kind of salt are you eating, and I would imagine that most, like with everything I've talked about on this podcast all along, most processed foods, the salt found in most processed foods and most, products that are made in bakeries and things like that are probably not the highest quality salt, just like they're not the highest quality oils.
You're absolutely right. And to compound that, most people get more sodium and more salt from the processed foods than they're adding table side. So if you are eating out of boxes and cans, yes, you probably have more salt in your diet than you need, and you're eating a form of salt that isn't a great form to start with. So once somebody starts to make some of these lifestyle changes and starts making more food at home, shopping at the farmer's market, eating more fresh foods, the need to add salt to the diet actually really goes up. Where many people, if you're eating, bags of chips and canned foods and canned soups and well-preserved items, yeah, you probably don't need to go out of your way to add additional salt to your diet. If you're eating natural foods, you actually do. And what they're finding is that you can have the highest or lowest blood pressure groups, and it's not the sodium levels, it's the interaction of potassium, magnesium, and calcium that are offsetting that. And so the holistic approach to food is a lot more important than trying to isolate any one of these particular items.
So if I understood what you said correctly, you actually said that much of the so-called table salt, they've pulled it through these pools where they've actually leached out all of these other minerals that are really important in the body. So what you're ending up getting, I think, is just sodium chloride, if I'm not mistaken. So it's pure, but there's no magnesium, there's no other minerals within that.
Correct. And so there's the twofold problem. So the first one is the removal of some of these other elements. And it's not a dietary source. Like if you look at seawater in the ocean, it's still mostly sodium and chloride. So a natural salt like the Himalayan or the Redmond real salt or the Celtic is going to be about 97% NaCl with about 3% of these other trace minerals. And 3% is not a lot. So it's not a salt. It was never supposed to be a dietary source of calcium or a dietary source of fat, but it's also not to be was never supposed to be pure sodium and chloride that was then coated with a chemical to stop its ability to interact with moisture. And so those are the two real important factors is yes, it's demineralized, and then there's so many additives, and then it's put on foods that we probably should be eating less of.
Okay, so then we have all of these difference, putting the table salt aside. We talked about Himalayan and Celtic and I don't know, sea salt and Redmond salt and kol hakavod, we say in Hebrew, like credit to you basically that like no one knows because you didn't say it in the bio that I believe your company is Redmond Salt, correct?
Correct.
So what is the difference in all of these salts and where is like Redmond salt mined and where is there a difference and is there a reason to have all of them? Is one of them better?
Oh, I love that question. So, when it comes to natural salts, obviously I am a little biased. I think the Redmond brand is a great one to start with, but I think there's really three questions that you could ask, and these three questions will lead you to a great salt. And it may be ours, it may be another brand, and I'm a big proponent of finding a good local product yourself. So if wherever you're listening from, if you're in South America and there's a beautiful natural healthy salt in South America, probably not worth shipping, our salt all the way there, and vice versa. So I think these three questions. The first question is who is producing it. With salt, that becomes very challenging for a lot of people because a lot of salt is commingled and there's just a jar at the grocery store. To find out who is producing it can be a challenge, but I think it's worthy of our efforts to find out who is producing what we're eating. And that could be the same if you're eating a kosher steak, if you're eating vegetables, eating fish, whatever it is you're eating. I think knowing who's producing it is an important question because that allows us to ask the second question, which is what's the source? Now with salt, that's really important because unfortunately we humans haven't been the best stewards of this planet that we live on. And so from Exxon Valdez to the BP oil spill to the Japanese disaster, our oceans and water is the universal solvent. It doesn't take that long for Exxon Valdez up in Alaska to end all the way down the coast of South America. It didn't take very long for the radiation meltdown in Japan to start washing up on the shores of California. And when the cruise ship goes down in the Mediterranean, it doesn't take too long before that spread. And so if you know who's producing it, you can find out the source. And I'm not saying that every ocean salt is bad, but there's certainly times and places where I would want to know where my salt is coming from. And with salt, the two main sources are a current ocean, like the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, Mediterranean. It could be a dead sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel, or the Dead Sea here in Utah called the Great Salt Lake, or it could be an ancient or prehistoric seabed, like the salt deposits that come from here in Utah that's sold as the Redmond real salt. There's another ancient seabed in Bolivia called the Bolivian pink salt. There's another one in Pakistan and Nepal that's called the Himalayan pink salt. But those are the main three sources. And so if you know who's producing it, you can find out the source. Then you can ask the third question is what are they doing to it? Are they taking anything out? Are they putting anything in? And if you can ask those three questions, whether you're at the farmer's market buying, some lettuce for dinner, or you're buying salt, I think you're going to get a good clean product. Now within that, there's a lot of fun variations. So you can have the Celtic French gray salt that has a really light, dusty flavor. If you take salt and instead of using a gray clay, you line that pond with activated charcoal, you can get a very black activated charcoal, dusty flavor to the salt, which can be really fun on a very white item like ice cream or butter or ghee. You could also take the salt and you actually can mix it with wine. If you were to take salt crystals and sit it in like a baking sheet with a red wine and then put it in the oven, you can bake off the or evaporate the wine with the salt, and you get a nice Cabernet salt that has a very sweet, lightly wine flavor that you can put on desserts, which is a lot of fun. So there's a lot of different things you can do with natural salt, and I encourage people to try them all, as long as you define first who's producing it, what's the source, what are they doing to it. Now, some of these salts are very expensive, and I certainly wouldn't throw them in a big pan of soup because as soon as it dissolves, the magic is gone. But for the top of salt caramels or truffles or a nice on top of some nice veggies or your favorite fish, there's a lot of fun things you can do with good, clean, natural salt. In addition to my go-to brand, which is Redmond.
First off, I love that you gave us recipes. So everyone should go try some of these. And I actually have, so I'm going to lead into the question by telling you what I think is an interesting, fun story that you might or might not like. So I came to Israel. So, I'm here in Israel. So the Dead Sea, obviously is here in Israel. And I came to Israel for the first time in 1983. My family moved here in 1984. And in 1983, I was 13, I think, and they took us to the Dead Sea, this place called the En Spa. And the En Spa at that time was not a spa. It was literally like there might have been toilets there and outdoor showers. And you paid something, you walked through the gates, and pretty much a little ways away, you had the Dead Sea at your feet. And on your right, there was like this something that looked like the size of a home swimming pool, and it was a sulfur pool. It smelled really bad. It was like a sulfur pool, and right in front of you was the Dead Sea. Fast or go forward, 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 forward. I went to the same Engedi spa with friends. I'm going to say when I moved back to Israel, let's say in 2010. And now the Engedi Spa is a big spa, and there's a swimming pool outside, and there's indoor Dead Sea pools and all these other things. And you go outside, and there's the swimming pool, and you go a little ways, and on your right is this empty sulfur pool that was there from the old days. And there's a little wooden sign that says there 1982. And then you walk, let's say another 100 meters, and it says 1987. And you walk another 100 meters, and it says 1991. And you literally 2.5 kilometers out, you get to where it's 2010. The Dead Sea is evaporating. So my question is, can these places, can Redmond salt, obviously the ocean's probably never going to run out of salt, but can we run out of some of these really good quality?
Yeah, it's a great question. Something that we are seeing here in Utah is similar to the challenge the Dead Sea is facing in the regression or the evaporation. And so the Great Salt Lake has gotten smaller and smaller every year, just like the Dead Sea has, as the droughts that we're seeing are increasing, especially here in the West. So the from the salt side with the Dead Sea, it's a little bit different because there is just so much salt there. Now, the Dead Sea, if you've ever tasted it, I'm not sure if you ever did, it's quite
By
bitter.
accident. Yes, by
Um,
accident, right?
so the Dead Sea, interestingly enough, is mostly magnesium chloride. Our oceans today are mostly sodium and chloride. And so the reason the Dead Sea tastes bitter is because our bodies are sodium and chloride based, not magnesium chloride based. And that's why the Dead Sea tastes bitter, where natural salt actually typically has a very sweet flavor if it's natural salt and hasn't been processed. As far as the salt running out, it's not something that we're going to see, and maybe in thousands and thousands of years, but our oceans today are getting increasingly salty. because they are because of the receding and because it's washing more salt into the oceans every day. The ancient deposits, this deposit that we're in here in Utah, geologists tell us that we've got about 900 years left of mining this deposit. So this and be the only reason it's 900 is at some point it just gets so deep that it's not economical to produce salt. And you see this in Europe. There are some mines over there that are now cathedrals. I don't know if you've ever seen some of the pictures. If you Google search, cathedral and salt mines, you go to Poland or Salzburg, and there's these beautiful cathedrals that have been carved into the salt mines in Europe. And so salt's fascinating, and it's very yeah. We're not going to run out of salt in multiple lifetimes.
Okay, so I think if I'm not mistaken, in like ancient times, didn't they use salt as like currency?
Yes, the term salary is based on salt. And there's an old saying that goes, "Is a man worth his salt?" Have you ever heard that saying before?
Mhm.
That actually comes because in Rome, because salt was so essential for life, in Rome, soldiers were actually paid a wage in salt. And they were paid in salt because it was used as currency, because in the spice trading days, salt was the most important outside of water and oxygen. Salt is the next most important part of our life. Outside of a spiritual discussion, the only difference in you and I visiting here one moment and both of us dead the next moment, outside of a spiritual discussion, is the absence of an electric current, because it's electricity that makes my hand move. It's electricity that allows my heart to pump and my thoughts to transmit through the electrons and the neurons. And so our bodies are literally saline solution in motion, and distilled water does not conduct electricity. You have to have salts, which is the term electrolyte, because it's the electricity that travels through our bodies. And so if you just drank distilled water every day, and your tears are going to be salty, your urine is salty, and your sweat is salty, and you're just drinking distilled water with no additional salts, you'll actually die in pretty short order from something called hyponatremia. You can live quite a long time without food. Some of us can live longer than others based on,
Yeah,
how much, reserves we have.
right.
But we can't live without salt, and we can't live without oxygen. And so that's the order of importance is oxygen, water, and salt. That's is what keeps us alive. And that's again outside of a spiritual discussion. That's really what we are, which is why when the EMTs show up, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to start an IV to rebalance that electric current, to rebalance the electrolytes, and then if they need to, they will bring out a defibrillator to restart or to defibrillate, to stop the fluttering of the heart, to reestablish that solid electric current that our hearts need to function on it. And so, yes, salt, I think it's just so fun.
What about electrolytes? And are they important for people? Like people like you or me or
Absolutely. Our bodies have to have electrolytes to survive. Our main, at the cellular level, um, the main function that salt has, I mean, it does a lot of things, but one is to help the cells regulate the intercellular and extracellular fluids. And they do that with sodium and potassium. And so just like sodium is so important and our bodies are sodium and chloride based, if we have all this sodium with very little potassium, we're going to have another problem, because that sodium potassium pump will open and close on the cell, bringing and releasing fluids as that sodium potassium exchange happens. And our early ancestors, if we went back, thousands of years ago, and we're eating more natural foods, eating a lot of green vegetables, we are going to be eating, our ancestors ate a lot more potassium than most of us do. And so most people should be going out of their way to make sure they're eating foods that are also rich in potassium. Because if you focus just on good, clean salt, which is sodium chloride when I say salt, and you don't source good amounts of potassium, calcium, magnesium, And even chloride. Chloride is this forgotten nutrient. We hear all about the importance of sodium and, oh, I need to work on my potassium levels. And people forget about chloride, but yet that is just as essential, for our bodies. We digest food with not only physical maceration of our stomach walls, moving the food and smashing the food, but we also use our teeth and our saliva. But when it gets into our stomach, our bodies use hydrochloric acid. That's what our stomach acid is. Now, we don't eat hydrochloric acid. Our bodies generate it and create it. And they do that. Hydrochloric acid is HCl, hydrogen and chloride. And if we are eating diets without any chloride, our bodies can't produce hydrochloric acid. And one of the first things that happens when somebody goes on a low salt diet or a salt restricted diet, they notice their digestion starts to really go to pot because they just don't have the basic ingredients that our bodies have always needed to digest food properly. And so I love this idea of going back to nature, relearning what our ancestors knew about basic natural health. And I love technology. I love medicine. I love all the things that we've learned. I love that we live today and not 2,000 years ago. But I think there's some things that our ancestors knew that we could do well to remember. Mostly that good, clean water, lots of sleep, natural salt, and a variety of natural foods is really way better than, going to the fast food place or living out of boxes and cans that becomes so easy in our society today.
Yes, I find it really interesting. And I kind of said for years, pretty much everybody in Israel does the army. Not everybody is a combat soldier, but from my area, most of the boys and some of the girls become combat soldiers. And I always find it fascinating that they'll keep them out training for hours and hours and hours on end, and they don't give them electrolytes. And then all of a sudden, like someone died, there was a kid who died a couple months ago. It was really, really hot. And today, when it is overly hot, they will usually cut the training or do the training at night instead of during the day. And I think he probably had some, with some sort of cardiac event, I think, but probably due to an electrolyte imbalance. So I don't understand why, they're so good about making sure the soldiers get water, but they're losing so much salt. So I'm
You're
just
you're
putting that out
absolutely
there that the army should be.
you're absolutely correct, and we see that here in the U.S. as well, where you'll have the soldiers in California or Texas. They're running, sweating, working hard, and then somebody dies because of hyponatremia, which is low salt. And football teams. It's interesting. There's a product here in the U.S. that some are familiar with. It's called Gatorade. That product was created because of the football team, the Florida Gators in Florida, and they're running in the hot Florida sun, sweating, drinking tons of water, but they're still dropping nauseated muscle cramps. And so they created a product to aid the Florida Gators, which was basically salt and sugar water, and they added food coloring. And you can make the same thing yourself with just I tell people the best, cheapest sports drink you'll ever make. Take a quart or a liter of good, clean water, add a quarter teaspoon of natural salt, a squeeze of lemon, and then a little bit of honey or agave or fig syrup or something that you like as a natural sweetener. And it will make the best electrolyte drink at pennies without any of the crap in all of the commercial sports drinks that we have on the market today. Something I was going to mention when it comes to diet, particularly, a lot of times today we have confused our cravings for salt for sugar. And so that's something that's really interesting, because if you're at work one day and you're feeling like, oh man, I'm craving sugar. If you have a jar of or a dish of salt crystals, and it's kind of hard to see those, but they're just salt crystals here. You can take one of those salt crystals, put it under your tongue, and it will actually taste very sweet if it's a natural salt, because most of us are, especially in a fasting environment, we are low salt. And as our salt levels drop, that flavor of natural salt cravings really spikes. And it'll also, when you're thinking you're craving sugar, oftentimes a little bit of salt under your tongue, especially if you're fasting, will knock that sugar craving away, and you're able to go way longer than you could if you were, if you weren't adding salt. And when you start going into ketosis, so as our bodies have natural glycogen that are going through our bodies, and when we have glycogen in our body, 1 gram of glycogen will hold about 8. Let's see, I wrote that. Yeah, so 1 gram of glycogen will hold 2 to 3 grams of water. And so as we start to drop the sugar levels that are passing through our bodies, not only does the water level start to drop, but so does the salt levels, because as that glycogen is burned up and is pulled out of the cells, it's pulling out 1 gram of glycogen pulls 2 to 3 grams of water. That water isn't distilled. That water is full of salt and minerals and electrolytes. And so oftentimes when somebody starts to fast or goes to a keto type diet, they'll get something called the keto flu, which is headaches and nauseousness. It's because those electrolytes are getting out of balance. And so as we start to fast, especially if we're doing a fast where we're still drinking fluids, by still drinking water and salt, you won't break your fast, but you'll be able to replace that fluid and those electrolytes that are getting lost through that ketosis process.
Oh, okay, that's great because yeah, it makes sense, or it would be a great thing to try that when you're craving sugar, to try to have some salt instead.
Now, one caveat to all of this is a healthy person. If you
Mhm.
have healthy kidney functions, your kidneys can process about 4 ounces of salt a day. That's a lot of salt. If you are on dialysis or on kidney failure, ignore absolutely everything that we have said today, because our bodies, when they're healthy, are designed to process a lot of salt. In fact, if you're in the hospital, you could get a liter of saline, which has more. 1 liter of saline solution has more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium, which is the daily recommended allowance here in the US. And you can have multiple bags of saline and not overdose on salt. But that's because your kidneys are healthy. If your kidneys are not healthy and you're in kidney failure, your body is not able to process salt, and they're going to have to start doing a lot of other treatments. So again, take the discussion with a grain of salt if you are in kidney failure or dialysis, because this would not apply to you.
Okay, well, where do you think that expression came from, right? That's a great expression. Take it with a grain of salt.
I don't know where that one came from, other than if you looked at, if you looked at a massive pile of salt, 1 grain, the crystal itself is like the size of a mustard seed, right?
Right.
And I think it's probably that same expression that salt crystals are a very small thing, but it
Right.
accomplishes a lot, like
Right.
a mustard seed.
Right. Right. So thinking of that, right, that salt can be in crystals, is there any benefit to like getting one of those grinders and grinding it yourself versus shaking it out of a salt shaker?
Great question. The short answer is no. If you were to crack a mustard, or if you were to crack pepper, when you crack that shell, it releases flavor and aroma because it's been preserved inside that shell. Salt is not that way. Salt, there's no benefit of cracking it table side like there would be with any other spice, cinnamon, mustard, pepper. It doesn't work that way. The only advantage, it comes to being able to adjust the size on the fly. So something we haven't talked about that I think would be good before we wrap up here is how the size of salt impacts its application. And with Judaism, that really comes into play because there's a terminology where, if you're Jewish or not, people have heard this term, and that's when we talk about kosher. So in salt, there's 2 meanings of the word kosher. Now, I know most of the audience here is Jewish, but for anybody that isn't, so in Judaism, kosher is the Jewish law of health. And there are certain foods that you can eat, as you know, and there's certain foods that you can't. And there's certain times during Passover where there's foods that are approved and ones that aren't. And then in addition to that, there's a process where a religious leader would come and approve or inspect to ensure that the food that's being sold that's approved for the Jewish community is in fact meeting those standards. And so sometimes here in the US, where people aren't as familiar with kosher, they might see a product that says kosher, or maybe it's the Orthodox Union symbol with the OU or the star K or the KSA, and they'll think that some rabbi has come and offered a blessing or a sacrament over the facility, which is just not the case. In salt, though, you can have salt that is kosher certified, and so here the one in front of me, there's this little OU symbol, which is the Orthodox Union. So we have a rabbi that comes to the facility. He inspects to make sure that we aren't doing anything that would impact the health or the cleanliness of this item according to the Torah. And he says, yep, it looks good. We will approve this for our membership, and that's how it is. Now, in salt, there's a different terminology for kosher, because you can have salt that is called kosher that has not been approved for the Jewish community, and you can have salt that's approved for the Jewish community that is not called koshering or kosher salt. And so the reason that we have these two different definitions is, and feel free, Dara, to correct me if I get things wrong here, because you are probably a better spokesman for Judaism than me. But in Judaism, blood is not kosher. And so if you want a piece of steak, you have to remove the blood from the steak, because otherwise you would be eating blood, which is not approved based on the law of health. Now, salt, if we back up to the very first few minutes of our discussion today, I mentioned that salt is hygroscopic, which means it absorbs and draws moisture to it. And so if you take a thin piece of strip steak and you cake it with salt crystals that are nice and flat and about the size that you might find on a margarita rimmer or on a pretzel, that salt crystal will suck the blood out of the steak without making the steak overly salty, because you can still scrape off those crystals once it's done. And that size of crystal that works really well to suck the blood out of steak is known worldwide in every community, Jewish or not, as kosher or koshering salt, because it makes meat kosher. And so this is our fine salt that you would typically use on the table side. That's kosher certified by the Orthodox Union. And we also have a larger flake of salt that we call koshering salt that is also approved for the Jewish, so it's kosher squared. And so that's just a fun part of salt that I think the Jewish community would relate to more than many people that I get to talk to.
First of all, I love that, because like you said, I know time is getting short. So I love that. I really, really love that. Before I ask my final question, I wanted to ask you one other little question. Is there recommended amount of salt that people should have per day?
So the USDA or the US Food and Drug says 2,300 milligrams. There is legislation on both sides trying to increase it and trying to decrease that amount. That 2,300 milligrams, assuming that's being added table side, is probably a good amount. However, there's a lot of research, and I can send you some articles you could put in the show notes, that shows that 2,300 milligrams that actually increases your risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, because salt is so essential. And so it's really confusing to people, because if you're eating really crappy foods with really crappy salt, yes, you should eat less crappy food and less crappy salt. But if you go back to our ancestors, 2,300 milligrams, if you are healthy, we don't have to limit the amount of salt we take, because our bodies are set up to balance that out. There is a safe amount of ascorbic acid or vitamin C, but you'd have a tough time eating too many oranges. There's a safe amount of beta carotene, which is found in carrots, but you'd have a tough time overdosing on carrots. And you'd have a tough time overdosing on salt if it's good, clean salt added to good, clean food with an abundance of water. because our ancestors and animals just don't overdose that way. It's only when we start adding it to foods that we shouldn't be eating that we'll start eating more than we should in forms that we shouldn't be eating.
That is perfect. And just to circle back and tie it in with what we talked about in the beginning, if you are someone that has high blood pressure, you need to change your overall diet. But maybe you actually would be fine or even okay to add good quality salt. The salt that is the problem is the garbage stuff that you're buying and the garbage stuff that's in all the garbage food. So what they really need to do is completely change their diet and actually add healthy, good quality salt. Real
There's
salt.
many healthcare professionals today that would echo that. There's a book called Salt Your Way to Health that talks exactly. It was by a Dr. David Brownstein. He's an MD here in the U.S. There's another one that's called
Salt Fix.
The Salt Fix by James D. Antonio. Great book. And so there's a lot that are saying exactly what you're suggesting there.
Okay, that was great. I was just echoing your words. It really came from you. I just like to make sure that everybody really understands it. So my final question is always, what does spirituality mean to you?
I love that question, and I knew that was coming, and so I've been thinking a lot about it. But for me, spirituality means remembering that all of us are connected in a greater way than we sometimes remember, and that whether some people might call it love, some people call it God, some people call it spirituality, but I think this belief and this reminder that all of us are connected to a greater oneness, I think is a beautiful idea. And I think, right or wrong, it will pull people together to remember, whether you say we're all God's children or you say we are all connected. For me, spirituality is remembering that all of us are connected to each other.
I like it. Thank you for that. And how can people find you? What's the best way if people have questions or they want to see what Redmond salt is, or what's the best places?
So the easy one to remember is just realsalt.com. Just as opposed to fake salt, it's just real, REALSALT, realsalt.com. You can get there. You can see all of our salt products. There's links to our parent company, which is Redmond. There's these 3 red mounds, which is why the name Redmond, the town was named Redmond. And that is Redmond, REDMOND, Redmond.life. But whether it's redmond.life or just realsalt.com is a good way to find us. And I'll send you some of those articles you can put links to in your show notes.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming on and doing this.
Thanks for having me on today.
My pleasure.
Hey guys, I am so excited to have Idan back with us. You guys know I love everyone that comes on, but Idan is really one of my favorites. She always has such interesting ways to bring the Torah alive, to connect with whatever the subject is this week that we're talking about. And when I wanted to re-release this topic that I believe is really important about, the health benefits of salt, I just felt like Idan would be able to shed some light and give us the scoop and the goods on this important topic. So, Idan, thank you for coming on again.
Thank you so much. Bezrat Hashem, from your words to God's ears, Bezrat Hashem, I hope to be able to bring that to fruition. And that is also the blessing of just having these opportunities. It's really always incredible. So thank you so much. Thank you for this incredible podcast. So salt, what is that? And the beautiful part is that it's so multifaceted. It is so immersed in culture, in medicine, in science, in history, and it kind of provides this beautiful roadmap throughout Tanakh, into halacha, into practicality and ritualistic parts of the religion, as well as in the spiritual. And so that's really just the beautiful part of looking at the world and seeing where we can find deeper connections. And so with salt specifically, I think we'll start, Bezrat Hashem, with a very ritualistic, rigid tradition that is brought into Judaism, and then we'll expand it and open it up to the more philosophical, midrashic interpretations and applications of that also to our life, Bezrat Hashem. So interestingly, the Rambam talks about, I wrote in Moreh Nevuchim, which is his sefer, talking about the korbanot, the offerings that were brought in the Beit Mikdash. And it's also beautiful for us to even learn this because it's not just theory anymore, right? Like Bezrat Hashem, we're really approaching a very tangible time of having the Beit Mikdash and whatever way that will manifest itself in the world, but having korbanot and having this actual physical, spiritual work come together. So I think that's also just in and of itself a beautiful thing. But he writes that salt is a huge part of these traditions, and there was not a korban that did not have salt in it. It was incredibly important and very makpid, very stressed and valued to have salt in the korbanot, in the offerings that were in the Beit Mikdash. And the question kind of is why? Like, what's the big deal about salt? What does it have to do with anything? And so interestingly enough, the Rambam brings an example and a explanation to this, to say that in the times of pagan worship, they were very stressed on having no salt in their worship by dafka putting it to the side. And so in Jewish ritual, and we have these beautiful traditions, we want to make sure that we're nothing like any other outside culture. But we really are our own, and we stand alone. And I think this is a beautiful metaphor, and we should hold that koach, is that Am Yisrael is unique to the rest of the world. We don't need to follow suit to how other governments see things or how other cultures do it. We are unique, and we know our guidelines and we know ourselves, and being able to hold that true is literally the foundation of Torah and Judaism, and the imagery of that in the Beit Mikdash, the Holy of Holies, of where that comes to play, of understanding that we have a unique experience, that in and of itself is expressed through this ritual of using salt in the korbanot. So we see, of course, there's all these benefits to it, right? It has to do with preservation, it has to do with salting the meat. These are all things that we see in practical applications today, and I'm sure there are many health benefits that were brought up in the podcast, but even just understanding that dichotomy of the spiritual and physical health. And so having a spiritual health of knowing yourself and knowing that we're not like the rest of the world, and we're unique in that way, and we have a special mission and a sense of pride within that separation, and to hopefully by sometimes following a physical or an external ritual actually enters into an internal place and an internal mentality, right? Sometimes it's from the outside in when it comes to health. And so also spiritual health, we see that. And
So wait, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Is that why when we take the chalot on Shabbat and we salt, I think it's to remember the Beit HaMikdash, right? Or the offerings, the Mizbeach and the...
Absolutely, yes. That's exactly where the Rambam is taking it from, because also we know that the table is a mizbeach. Our dinner table, our in our home, we have an opportunity to literally create the Holy of Holies within our home, and so that also in itself has such a deep message, because if you have a mizbeach, you have like the Beit Mikdash in your home. What kind of conversations are you having at the table, right? What kind of treatment are you having to each other? So what kind of brachot are you making? What intentions are you having when you're sitting at the table? And so there has also this beautiful spiritual charge in the mundanity of, in the mundane, I think that's a word, I don't know, but in the mundane of life. In the mundane of life, of sitting at your table with your family, having a meal, and being able to bring up the highest of spiritual offerings, right? That we know that it was the Kohen Gadol, it was these beautiful representatives, the Kohanim, and we're able to literally build that in our own home, to make our home a Holy of Holies. So for sure, that is where these come from. And salt is just that tiny little reminder that really sticks with you in an actual way. Salt, also, the components of salt we know bring out the actual flavor. That's why any chef will tell you to always add a dash of salt to any type of food. Why? Because it brings out the true essence. And so when we build in our homes the Holy of Holies, that is the true essence of a Jewish home, right? Knowing ourselves and also knowing the people around us. And so that's just... absolutely. I love that.
I love that too. I got like the chills. That was great.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Thank God. Okay, so now we know that. And I wanted to trail more into these bigger themes. And in Judaism, we see it also. There's so many themes in the Tanakh of salt coming up. And one notably, of course, is Eshet Lot. How could we talk about salt without talking about the woman that turned into a pillar of salt? And I, right, like this is a notable story, and everything is with purpose. And if we believe what we believe, then we know that Hashem chose for a reason that she turned into a pillar of salt. And so what does that represent? So this is very fascinating. I was trying to research and understand, like, where does this come from? Because again, we get these stories as kids and even in, seminary and yeshiva, and we get maybe a little bit of a deeper insight, but still, it's weird. And we're trying to understand.
Right. Like, why not sugar? Or like
Yeah.
anything. Just, you're right.
Ash. I don't know. Like something
Right.
that, but Hashem designed it so beautifully and creatively that it causes us to question and really dive into it. So Rashi actually comments on this, and he has the same question that we have, like, why salt? Like, what is that? And many of the Meforshim and many of the commentaries also play into this of it's Mida Keneged Mida. We know that in the story, Abraham comes to Lot's home, and they have guests, and Lot was kind of the person that stuck out. He was the salt, right? He was the dafka, like we said before, the metaphor of Am Yisrael having a totally opposite ritual than the pagan religions around them. So also here, Lot was standing out, and he wanted to give the guests salt. And his wife was completely, shocked by this. She said, "This is not our cultural norm. We don't want to introduce this into our home," which was Sodom, which was like the lowest of the low of places. And so we learn in the Torah, we saw this also with the Makot in Exodus, of the story of all the 10 plagues and how each of them had actually a specific connection to how the Egyptians had treated the Jews in Mitzrayim. And so understanding that Mida Keneged Mida, right? Like this measure for measure, that Hashem really works with justice. And that's another thing that Rashi brings up, which is so powerful, which is another kind of plug into why salt. So it says that the world, when Hashem created the world, and this is a very deep mystical idea, but it's also practical for us to understand, is Hashem created the world with justice, right? That there is night and day, there's a balance. And so with that gvura, with that strength, with that sense of balance and justice, there's intense punishment, right? Because when you have justice, it can be very intense. And Hashem, when he created the world, understood and saw that there also was a deep desire and a need for kindness. That there also needs to be a balance between chesed and gvura, of strength and kindness and mercy and understanding and humanity, right? Like, we're not perfect beings. You create a perfect world with imperfect people. And so what does that mean? So the representation of salt, of having this explosive metaphor of an imperfect person in a world full of justice, and having that balance come in. And so Rashi goes on to explain, and this is so beautiful, is that salt is actually the manifestation of the balance between gvura and chesed. Why? Because chesed is immersed in water and fluidity of giving, right? The entire world is just ocean, it's giving.
Can you translate what chesed is in case there's anyone listening who don't know what these words are?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Yes. Chesed connects to kindness, to giving, to what some may say being more fluid, and forgiving, all of these things. Mercy, right? Like the left and right side of the brain, the creative brain, and the more numbers and regimented part of the brain. So we can even say that. It's deep Kabbalistic ideas, but again, appear in our day-to-day life. And so being able to really tap into that is also a perfect opportunity for self-development. So that's exactly what Rashi is saying. He's saying that there has to be a balance between the loving and kindness that we have and the justice and the boundaries, and understanding that they have to have a place for both. So salt is the manifestation of both, because why? Oceans and water spreads. It can be everywhere. But land, but gvura, but earth puts a boundary, right? Between the beach and the ocean, there's a boundary, and the love doesn't overflow in. And so having that balance between the two is exactly salt, because salt is the heat of the sun, and the of these boundaries and the fluidity of the ocean. And so it's a very mystical, new age sounding, but it's true. Some things are just true. And the way that we can understand that is that, again, endurance. And I think that this is a huge thing that salt represents. Salt is used for preservation. And so the most enduring thing is the balance between kindness and love and boundaries and strength and knowing when to say no and knowing when to say yes.
Oh, that is so poignant for what's going on right now, but I'm not going to go off on that topic.
I'll say just one more point in terms of also the relevance for now, and I'm not sure if it was the same direction, but that you were thinking, but in the Chodesh Elul, we just started that now, right? We're on this incredible journey to judgment, right? Like you could say it's a journey of self-discovery. God is with us. God is connected to us. This is a time of real authenticity. But we're leading up to the days of awe, the high holidays, which are days of intense judgment. And so using this opportunity to seek out balance between knowing loving kindness, having kindness to ourselves, kindness to others, even kindness to God, to say, wait, maybe God isn't this harsh judge that's, waiting to strike me down with a lightning bolt. Maybe there's actually a beautiful relationship here. And so being able to embrace that balance between the two and understand that this is something that is so embedded in our culture. Not only is it in the highest of high of the Beit HaMikdash, but again, it's also in our homes, and being able to understand that it's accessible at any time, at any point. So maybe with that, I'll just give us a bracha and any comments or insight I'd love to hear. But just that we should have the opportunity to be like salt, right? To bring out the true essence in those around us, to seek out our true essence. And with that, understand that there's a beautiful balance between giving and being extroverted and seeking outward, but also knowing when to say no and having a holy boundary, and when to know ourselves and know that we're not always with everybody around us. And that's a beautiful thing as well. Bezrat Hashem, we should have that.
I don't think I could add anything better than that. I think that that was a beautiful bracha and something that is so perfect for exactly for this time of year. It was just Rosh Chodesh Elul, and I definitely couldn't have said it any better than you. You said it so well, which is why I love having you on.
Thank you, Baruch Hashem. It's really my pleasure. Seriously, thank you.
Thank you so much. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Please seek guidance from a trusted healthcare professional. By listening to this podcast, you release Holy Health and all of its guests from all liability. I'd like to thank Yakir Abelow for editing this podcast.